Hello, and welcome to Varnblog. Today is another monologue, and I have a lot to speak about, given the situation with the Supreme Court in Texas, given the situation with the Biden administration and its declining popularity, given the situation with the Oklahoma hospitals not being filled with just COVID patients, but now people with overdoses of horse dewormer, given the situation that the new variant outbreaks of COVID have hit countries that have not been hit very hard in the past, given 1,000 situations. Sometimes we have to go and look at our recent history. It's no secret that I'm co-writing a book on Christopher Lasch and that I've been obsessed with the ideas of Aleister McIntyre and with a lot of people who are associated with, quote, right wing of Marxism, unquote. I also have found a kind of mirror inversion of the blind idiot patriotism that we see in with blind idiot face and other historical realities. The idea that the Soviet Union was a shining city on a hill, and that Lenin was a George Washington figure, an inversion, is something that I just can't take seriously the more I study the situation. And you might go, well, what does that have to do with the things you mentioned in the beginning? Well, we'll get to that. The title today, Cycles of Struggle, Our Gust of Popular Sentiment, came from a longtime internet acquaintance of mine, Al Locascio, who is, I think, semi-famous for his translations of Michael Heinrich's work into English. That's not what I'm going to talk about today in regards to Al. But Al made the observation that on Twitter, of all places, that he didn't know what cycles of struggle meant because cycles of struggle seem to conveniently always overlap with cycles of elections. That the cycle structure was, about every 2 years and every other 2 years. I was thinking about this when I was discussing some stuff with Pascal Robert yesterday after epic a podcast. And I was also thinking about the long durée of Afghanistan. For Afghanistan's America's longest war, right? And that's only if we start it after 9/11. If we give it its real beginning date in some ways, which is 1979, I think the only war that you could say was longer was the depossession of the Western continent itself. When you think about the fact that since the New Left, the cycles of popular struggle have increasingly fit in with cycles of political attention spans and media cycles around that, one becomes more than a little bit cynical. Yes, there are other cycles of struggle where you see labor outbreaks all over the world, including in places like China, where it's tied to business cycles which we understand the existence of, but do not understand the causal mechanism for. It seems to be over-determined in the classical sense, in that there are too many different things that cause them. So they're a statistical reality, something that Marx glommed onto dialectically a long, long time ago. But why they exist? Well, overproduction is one of the problems, but then there's a myriad of others. Any time that things become fragile, and fragility is an increased state of the global economy. We were sold for 20 years, and I know since most of us have the attention span of a goldfish, see also these cycles of popular struggle, that the increased global nature of the economy was actually a source of stability. And it seemed like for a while it was. But capital being an international system, or capitalism being an international system with various different subsystems that don't operate the exact same way, limit the way we can actually view all of this. And I sound very sedate when I'm talking about this, but like, it takes an oil shock, a pandemic, any one small thing causes ripples in an overly centralized global supply chain that is always cutting any excess capacity down to the bone to increase its profit margins. Anything can trigger a cycle. And if anything has become clear, almost no one, and including myself, can tell you exactly how the economic situation is actually functioning during COVID. All the predictions are seemingly wrong, and as soon as one starts to look to be true, another one comes out of the woodwork and seems to undo it. There's both a labor shortage and a bad jobs report. So we don't focus on these economic cycles, and in fact, we always, in Marxist circles, rely on some vulgar form of historical materialism as if the GDP ratios were exactly predictable to what was going on in politics, when the cycles of up and down in the left in the last 20 years are far more predictable off of reactions to liberal politicians. I told you I don't believe in the PMC thesis, and that's still true. The PMC thesis flattens out a whole lot of things. But we do have to look at a couple of basic things in which would make the PMC thesis seem attractive. One, we do seemingly have a, quote, meritocratic elite with elite institutions where even things that are not in the mainstream increasingly require you to have hyper-credentialization. You have Ivy League podcasters in the left podcast circuit, my friends. People who were groomed to be political managers. And yet it hasn't happened. We had all the conditions for labor power to be at its strongest, and yet it has not been at its strongest. If anything, we've seen a decline in radicalism that we were beginning to see under Trump, which tells us something about the nature of that radicalism. When given a chance, many of the unions, not all of them, and I don't want to overgeneralize here, but many of the unions step back from such a position. But this isn't historically new either. It's happened in World War I and World War II. It's happened during cold winters, during mining strikes. There's a history of the fact that labor battles are sectional, but the working class and the public is not in the same way, leading to a tactical retreat that ends up being a strategic failure. This is not new either. If you would study the history of the U.S. labor movement, it's probably the main takeaway. So why is it then that the cycles of struggle are tied to the spectacle of our national elections? See, I see a lot of comments here that are smart, but are also using the prestidigitation of language not to totally look at things. So I'm going to read this one here because I think it's insightful, but also doesn't say as much as it seems to. Sorry, York. Doesn't seem surprising to me. The opportunity was there, but the necessary preconditions for the labor movement has been missing for a long, long time. And I think that's totally true, but why? Like, why are the preconditions missing? And why are they missing even in countries that don't have the US's labor history? Yes, they have more robust social institutions, and yes, they have more robust labor institutions, but even Sweden and Denmark are having political crises. While we've been talking about masking up for a bajillion years, whether or not we should defend some corrupt geriatric politician in California, we've also been not dealing with the fact that it's increasingly obvious to everyone that they don't have the means to power. And what are you doing? What are we all doing? Venting on YouTube. Even the people complaining about how leftism is a ready-made ideology to exist to foment anti-communism while we should be organizing the workers, they're not shutting the fuck up and getting off Twitter. Are they? In fact, their only response to leftism is to engage in critiquing leftism on the grounds of leftism. That's a wounded ego. That's the shock of self-recognition. That's the shock of the recognition that what you were doing was perhaps captured in a waste of time, and now you're going to bloviate about how you should be doing the opposite thing, but in ways that resembles the same thing you were doing. These aren't cycles of struggle. These are gusts of popular and narcissistic sentiment. I'm going to read some quotes and then apply them to what we're seeing right now, and I'm going to get to the actual politics of the day. The manager treats ends as given outside of his scope. His concern is with technique, with effectiveness. The therapist also treats ends as given, as outside of his scope. His concern is also with technique, with effectiveness. Neither manager nor therapist in their roles as manager or therapist do or are able to engage in moral debate. They purport to restrict themselves to the realms in which rational agreement is possible. That is, to the realm of fact, to the realm of means, to the realm of measurable effectiveness. But McIntyre points out that the effectiveness is defined as part of the good. And the good entails a moral and political argument. But it is not actually anything that we define. Instead, we go off basically sentimentalism, which we rationalize. Which is the point of Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue. If you look at the substance of deontology or the substance of utilitarianism, you find that it basically fits whatever mood of the day exists. Now, you might go, what does this have to do with leftism? But this isn't just true for moral argument. It's also true for political ones. These aren't rationally held, historically grounded positions. They're gusts of popular sentiment where people are letting off their identitarian allegiance in a friend-enemy calculus where they don't actually have the power to enforce or ascribe a friend-enemy distinction. They are not even sovereigns of themselves, much less the sovereigns of nations. They couldn't control themselves getting out of their basement and getting off Twitter while they talk about the discipline ready for a revolution. Do you think such people could run all of society with central planning? Do you think such a deracinated subject as a bunch of college grads who, in lieu of a stable employment, started plotting the revolution in their basement? Do you think they can run everything? Yes, in many ways, the immigrant community and the immigrant around the communist in Sweden, and then the exile period actually was similar. It was a bunch of intellectuals who were D-class A and abroad and in debate societies and salons. Now they held jobs. They kept things down. You're like, oh, but you're shaming those who can't. I'm not shaming those who can't. I'm shaming those who don't. Nor do I think we all should be trying to force everyone into some workers' paradise where a bunch of nerds tell us how many hours we can work a day. From the, again, benefit of their basement. People who can't even run a Walmart supply chain. Do I expect them to be able to define what the good is? No, I do not. That mean rant is to point out a problem right here in the heart of things, is that these politics are not properly political. Now, a lot of the people I pull from Aristotelian virtue theory. Oh, they also pull from psychoanalysis. I do not. I don't totally dismiss psychoanalysis. I consider it a proto science, an attempt at a science that had some very interesting insights and long became an internal coherence game and disconnected from any kind of verifiability. But there are some things about that conception of narcissism that I pull from Lasch that I think people need to consider. You see, it's easy to get mad, like I just did, at a lot of people for, delusions of grandeur. It's harder to look at why that would become a systemic thing. Why are there all these overproduced quasi-elites, many of whom actually don't come from elite backgrounds? They were people like me who came out of the working class. Others are downwardly mobile, as a friend of mine calls it, fail sons of doctors and lawyers. Some of which are the elites of other countries who've come here and have children, and their children, while highly educated and ambitious, have no place to go. There is a crisis of the overproduced elite, in quotation marks, and so much that everyone was told they could be one. The shining city on the hill in the US, this crypto thing, is the idea that it sold everyone that you could be the elite to the world. No, we can't outproduce the Chinese worker. And there'll be more, there'd be more elites from China just from 1% of them because of raw numbers. And yet, maybe in the United States, we could be a community of the cultural and scientific management of society. But this brings me back to MacIntyre, and I'll get to Lasch in a minute. We never figured out what the effectiveness was for. The pragmatism was circular. This is what I mean by pragmatism is not pragmatic. It doesn't know what its aim is. It accepts the cash value of things, the immediate use, without questioning what kind of reason is the use for. And there's a truth that a lot of people aren't going to be the vanguard. You can't. You're not all Lenin. I'm not even sure Lenin was Lenin the more I study it, but you're definitely not even that. This is not a great man theory of history, though. The conditions are fundamentally different. Even if you were Lenin, you wouldn't be Lenin. If someone was to clone Lenin and put his DNA into a body right now and set him up in one of these countries, like the United States or even Russia, maybe, the social constraints on him would hamper his being in such a way that the conditions that come out of it would probably not lead to anything like what we saw the first time. Even with everything, even with all the non-social inputs being the same. This is not to say that there's no biological nature to humans or anything like that. It's that you can't separate the person, the biology, from the social society and the outcome. So getting mad at the Baker and Farwells for generation Millennial and Z is easy. They're obnoxious twits. And yet, I'm going to flash this up here because I think this is true, and I've been mean to this commenter before. The rational kernel of the overproduced elite is the existence of many worker and middle-class origin people who want to be intellectuals without any formal debate or research-oriented space outside of uni. Yeah, and there's no space for them. All right? We've been trying to produce an organic intellectual class in a context of a meritocracy that didn't ever actually exist. And the uni can't supply that all. And most of the uni is now increasingly just sucked up into management. For all our complaints of the medieval structure of universities, which are, by the way, literally medieval, the problems that they have now are not their medievalness, ironically, even though that limits their ability to do effective research in a lot of ways. It is their modern administrativeness. One that is tied up in the ideas of the liberal administrative state. We become therapists and managers to ourselves, trying to think that we can be little Lenins in a way where we know what the good is, and we can enact it because someone enacted it in the past in completely different historical conditions. And to be fair, I'm going to be fair to everyone who says that, because Marx points out that this is an inevitable thing. To learn to embrace the new almost always involves role-playing the old. But what we did not see, and what, frankly, I don't think Marx dealt with, because Marx was not dealing with human psychology, I've often pointed out the Hegelian assumptions of Marxism, even when you start divorcing them from Hegel and into materialism, never got to a sufficiently complex science of the mind, and thus Marx's theory of mind in either its humanist or structuralist form is remarkably unrobust. Hence why we talk about stuff like individualism versus collectivism as if that ever had any meaning. There is no individual self. The individual itself is undifferentiated. The wild man myth. Undifferentiated, unsocial. You have no you without someone to contrast it with. Conversely, collectivities are imaginations of individuals. Aggregates exist. And aggregates have statistical rules. But that's not the same as a collectivity. So collectivist cultures have an image for which they can project, and people can try to fit in or not. But often this actually backfires. And what you actually see in, some cultures that are highly collectivist, in quotation marks, is people who are actually more individualistic in their day-to-day interactions. The binary doesn't tell you that much, but it gives you a whole lot of explanations and ideological explanations for the way things are in the United States. Or it seems to. But really, it's still a reflection of a kind of narcissism. All right? The deracinated communities plays into this. So you think you can have friend-enemy distinctions when you don't have the power our sovereignty for those distinctions to matter, where it's just about your personal orientation of who you like and dislike, and not about trying to hold any political polity together. And by the way, the sovereign assumes that there's already a, quote, legitimate polity. It does not assume that you are making one. This is why areas that want strong centralized states tend to glom on to this fascist jurist theory, even though they ignore the parts of it that are inconvenient, such as ideological and ethnic threats. Because remember, the enemy was not an enemy ideologically. They were a biological enemy, a spiritual enemy, which polluted the singular idea of the nation. That part of the book, when liberals approach it, whether from Agamben or from some Chinese Marxist theorist, is cut out of Carl Schmitt conveniently. But if we're honest, you're not even that. You don't have the ability to set free enemy distinctions except for who you like and dislike. And that's a narcissistic matter of taste. That's a sign that you do not have to work with people that you're not used to. If you had to work within the working class, you had a working class thing, as anyone who's ever been in a union or even a large job, you're dealing with assholes. You deal with people like me. I am not always the easiest person to get along with. What makes me a good speaker for stuff like this can make me an awful person on a day-to-day life. And I try to treat people fairly well on an interpersonal interaction level. But, personality is what it is. If you constantly make distinctions based off your ideational preferences and not the function of any kind of social compact, well then what are you trying to build, and what are you really doing? Well, what you're actually doing is projecting yourself beyond you. I'm going to share this because I actually know a lot about this. Leo Strauss and Carl Schmitt actually exchanged a whole lot of letters. And Schmitt, while never admitting to Strauss, as far as I know, and nothing that I've ever read, never admitted that, never admitted that Strauss was right. But Schmitt was at the behest of the liberal state, a liberal state that has, has basically in an ironic way used him instrumentally. So these gusts of popular sentiment come out of a psychological need to project beyond yourself. And if we shade people for that, we're not being fair or correct, because we all do it. That is what community is. But in a community, there's a group of this is the rational kernel of truth of communitarian conservatism, and why we look at identity communities of oppression with almost longing, because the oppression has enforced conditions that have made community seem from the outside more viable, if only by exclusion. Jewish cultural tradition seems more vibrant because it's diaspora. The Chinese diaspora holds on to more Chinese traditions. The Black community is oppressed and seems to have a massive amount of cultural production, even though it suffers from its own internal class contradictions, which are often hidden by larger statistics. Let us ask ourselves, as we are honest, one of the reasons why the post-Marxist milieu seems so appealing 20 years ago, and it seems so damned now, and yet it's still become the common sense of the left, as came up in our conversation yesterday. As I've been saying for a long time, empires can take a long time to die and often collapse as an eschatological hope. But it's not just empires now. You have an ecological crisis that is going to be bad. What's likely to happen? You see, yeah, there's a binary given here. I'm going to share it by commenter Sean McManus here. Which is more likely? The United States fractures to a set of more localized states, a la the European Union, or we move towards some kind of progressive centralism? Here's the thing. If you're looking at what's happening now, the answer is both. As we've seen by the Texas the Texas law, by shadow docket, so that the Supreme Court doesn't have to take responsibility for what it's done. It's led a blatantly unconstitutional law. And I don't mean unconstitutional just in its fact of the fact that it negates Roe v. Wade as modified by Casey in 1992. I mean the fact that it actually sets up a quasi new way of enforcement, which is based on a weird use of civil forfeitures that are blatantly designed to get political outcomes in ways that have never been allowed before. And the Supreme Court, and the most centralized and undemocratic institution in the United States, actually, because it wants an outcome but doesn't want to take responsibility for it, wouldn't even comment on it in a responsible manner. See, so what you have is both. The fracturing allowed by a central power that just doesn't want to take responsibility for what it is doing. Now, that's not just a conservative problem, and indeed, the creation of the almost unitary Supreme Court was actually mostly a liberal creation. After all, liberals comforted themselves that not just the court protected individual rights, but after the court did so, they became popular, and in some sense, they did become popular because it was easier to be exposed. Less things were hidden under the law. And yet, it seems now that was one of the most fundamental mistakes of American progressivism. And I'm not even a fan of American progressivism, but over relying on the courts empowered a judiciary that could be easily stacked by an executive in a short period of time. I'm being asked about my thoughts on Adolf Fried's non-site essay on the Reichstag, and I think Reed believes in a popular front. I think the logically popular front is no matter how much he complains about the left, no matter how much he chastises it, the risk is always there that you cannot jump from the Democrats. Let me make it as clear as day to you. These gusts of popular sentiment are not cycles of struggle. Yes, we're all struggling, but they're not. That how we treat them is based on a media cycle. I got criticized and yelled at by left communists and communizers and Stalinists for saying that I bet, despite the fact there's real unrest going on right now, that you won't hear about it, and because you don't hear about it, it doesn't take off in the way George Floyd stuff did. And people are like, you can't be that way. And yet it is, isn't it? It's not that there's never unrest. There's plenty of it. It never goes anywhere. Those with wealth and power cover themselves and others are disposable. See, that's something that I think is interesting because that's been true forever, except in maybe societies with low social surplus. Occupy was an interesting example of this because it happened under a Democratic president, but it was interesting the end of a kind of politics. The post-Marxist anarchist politics that dominated the United States effectively died with Occupy because they didn't know what it wanted other than the event. Well, what do you guys want other than the party? I'll be damned if I know. Free college, sure, although as I pointed out to people, Peru has free college. South Korea has free college. It becomes an elite game. Depends on how much free college there actually is. And if a private sector steps in to make up the difference because of the increasing need for credentialization. Occupy eventually made a list of demands, and they were a fucking joke. I said so at the time. It was the gust of sentiment of a time. They weren't even coherent. This brings me back to Afghanistan, and maybe a quote that I'm going to read you in full. I want you to sit with it for a while. This is why I'm writing a book on this figure, by the way, even though I think at the end he gave up. I don't think free college is bad in and of itself. It just doesn't fix crap by itself. It's a non-fix. I think student debt is a bane on the working class and on immigrant groups, etc. But that doesn't change. That doesn't change much ultimately. I'm going to read this quote for you, and I want you to sit with it. Time after time in this century, which was the last one, it has been shown that the dream of influencing the war machine is a delusion. Instead, the war machine corrupts the intellectuals. The war machine cannot be influenced by the advice of well-meaning intellectuals in the inner councils of government. It can only be resisted. The way to resist it is simply to refuse to put ourselves at its service. That does not mean playing at revolution. It does not mean putting on blackface and adopting the speech of the ghetto. It does not mean tuning in and dropping out. It does not mean engaging in desperate acts of conscience which show one's willingness to take risk and to undergo physical danger. Mass as a higher selflessness, they become self-serving, having as their object not truth or even social change, but promotion of the individual's self-esteem. The more they betray at a deeper level, the same loss of faith which drives others into the service of men in power. A haunting suspicion that history belongs to the men of action and the men of ideas are powerless in a world that has no use for philosophy. It is precisely this belief that has enabled the same men in one lifetime to serve both the Communist Party and the CIA in the delusion that they were helping to make history, only to find in both cases what they made was a lie. But those defeats, those revelations that the men of action, revolutionists or bureaucrats, scorns the philosopher whom is able to use, have not led the philosopher to conclude that he should not allow himself to be used. They have merely reinforced his self-contempt and made him a ready victim of a new political cause. Lash, The Agony of American Left. That doesn't just go for the war machine, my friend. You think you can use the institutions of power without dismantling them? Grow up. Better people than you have tried, and they have made the situation worse. This is my real response to my social democrats friends. Not that we should be abstentionist. Not that we should make our non-voting or voting some big moral category that makes us feel like we know the truth about the system and don't participate or can try to control it. Vote your conscience if you're going to vote, and if you don't have anyone to vote for, don't vote. On the Supreme Court, I've heard all these liberal podcasts going, this is the cost of not participating. If we'd have had Hillary Clinton, this wouldn't have happened. Really? Would the Republicans have had the Senate anyway if Clinton and Trump had won? Then what would have been different? No, you probably wouldn't have got Garland, you wouldn't have got Coney Barrett, but you also wouldn't have got any liberal justices through either. Don't tell yourselves nice little, if only it could have been. I know the consequences would have been different if we didn't. Stop it. Deal with reality as it is and quit shaming people for not going the way you wanted, and instead start building towards what you want. Liberals have spent generations trying to shame people into their positions. And you know what? The Chapo people, the dirtbag left, the social democratic left was good at calling them out until that also happened to them and they became the same whiny little prigs. Who are they whining about indeed? The PMC, who's the left that didn't vote for them? You ever notice that it's structurally similar to the same thing that the Democrats did about them? The first thing I told you was that there are no adults in the room, including us. The closest thing we saw to adulthood is actually being discussed in the chat right now, which was the self-organization of people in the Milwaukee and a lot of the Rust Belt cities. The problem is that it doesn't scale. There's no coordination, and thus, while it can take local wins under the grand scheme of the nation, we're not even getting the global capital, it's crushable pretty quickly. But it is also the first taste you have at something like self-organization. It is in those moments, because in those moments there's actual community. And I don't mean the fetishized community. Community is often a way people use to get out of the situation because it's a vague term. But you have actual responsibility with actual skin in the game, with actual people you care about, with actual results or failures. You have to deal with your failures. You have to deal with your blowback, and you have to work. Doesn't mean that we want all society to be that way. Society can't be run off of constant toil. Nor can you deal with the fact that it really doesn't scale in terms of power. But it's the only thing we've seen where we saw something like organic community. And you know what? It wasn't just the rightists who wanted to shut. In fact, the rightists wanted to play fight with it as a distraction to get people to scare people into believing that we were about to descend in the Civil War, which people like Robert Evans and some anarchists like literally toyed with from the opposite direction. I'm sorry. Not that I don't think it couldn't happen here. I do, but the military is not going to just sit on its hands while there's a civil war, you dipshits. Man, I don't mean my audience, but like, come on, let's be serious for a second. And that was last year, as I thought there was no serious person in the room during the fever dreams in the middle of the election cycle. The closest thing I saw to that was people doing actual community building in Milwaukee and the Minneapolis and St. Louis. You don't win a battle against global capital one city at a time. Unfortunately, you couldn't even win it one state at a time. And I mean nation states of large imperial varieties. But I do think that you are right that if one sees the kernel of anything like a self-sufficient left, it is not in bitching about how shitty leftists are on the internet. It is not inquiring about AOC, even though, let's be honest for a second, all the people who defended her need to eat crow. It is in looking at stuff like that and actually figuring out what it would take to have people invested enough to really build communities. Do you think the fast turnaround of media cycles accelerates the generation of political movements, halts their ability to generate and sustainable movements in the first place? Yes. In fact, I think the technology itself does. I'm going to sound like a Luddite for a second. Technology has a teleos. It's designed to do something. And the teleos of most social media is engagement and dopamine addiction. It's not that technology is inherently bad. I'm not some anti-civ anarchist, but I have to be honest about what that is and what it means. And I'll be frank with you, a lot of my friends on the left, many of whom I respect, were the first to yell boomer at me when I pointed this out 10 years ago. That screen refresh is a way to build dopamine addiction, and that it shortens executive function, and that we've known it since the 80s. That there is a very real truth that television was bad for you and computers are worse. They make you easily distractible, it's harder to read, etc. Now, I can rail against the sun about this all I want to, and perhaps that is a boomer trait to yell at clouds about it, but it's a fact. And it's a fact that's multi-generational. And in fact, the older generations who didn't grow up with the technology are actually the most harmed by it. So this is not even me like wagging my finger at the youngins. But I have kids increasingly every year. I have hard stats on this, that we have more and more kids with such bad anxiety they cannot talk to other people without a technological mediator. They're that afraid as children. Do you know what that implies? So yes, I think the media cycle and the screen refresh and 1,000 things have formed the clue. No, I don't think it was a conspiracy to weaken the working class. I don't think things work that way. There's no one in charge. There are imperialists doing imperialist things, but the more I have met them, the more full of crap they are and more likely to have drank their own Kool-Aid. No one is coordinating all this. It would be nice if there was. But you live in a stochastic world, okay? This is the first thing you must accept. That the true terror is not that there's evil people running the show, is that abstractions are and very little else. And the abstractions don't make decisions. They aren't real. It is what I call non-arbitrary. It's not random, but it's pretty close. What drives America right now? Profitability. What drives China? Profitability. But China has a competent state sector. It will, because it believes it will eventually transition to socialism one day. And I do think there are people in the Communist Party who actually believe that. Will occasionally actually rein in individual capitalists. But as I point out to people who get all misty-eyed about that, they will not rein in capital. They use the same bank-to-bank interest rate calculations that we do, and while they are trying to do small co-op things, they are also securing property rights left and right. And the things that we consider social goods like medicine, schooling, etc., are still the least socialized in China. So if they're a socialist state, they might be able to shoot Jack Ma in the head, but they can't tell their capitalist class to go fuck themselves. Not as a whole. Also, for people who like China but have a problem with the PMC, China is the most labor aristocratic government that I can think of. It has some pretty strong bourgeois elements, but less so than probably any European or Anglo-American state. And yet, it is dominated by lawyers and doctors and engineers, just like our Congress is dominated by loyal doctors and engineers. So I am agnostic on China in some ways. It is undoubtedly in the core of the capitalist system, and that cannot be denied. It also, I do not think that it's a cabal by the CPC to never convert to socialism. I think its road has put it in a bind. It's also, by the way, the largest polluter on Earth. It's just not per capita like the United States, but its lifestyle is catching up. The shortage in the diamond market is from demand from China and India, where bourgeois lifestyles are becoming more popular objectively. No one is going to save you. Get that through your thick skull. If there's any saving to be done, it will be done by yourselves. No one is going to save you. Everyone exists in this sclerotic and increasingly uncontrollable system. I do not mean you're going to save yourselves as individuals either, because frankly, that's not particularly possible. This is a good question. Is the withdrawal from Afghanistan going to lead to possible drawdown in military spending? I don't know. I don't pretend to know what I don't know. I suspect no, actually, because I suspect what's going to happen is this is pivoting towards a Cold War in Asia, and that's what the whole purpose is. That Biden's willing to take a hit for the team there to do that. But that a lot of people in the military and the foreign policy establishment, even the liberal one, want that and Afghanistan. And that's when there's been deliberate confusion of stuff about like the Taliban and ISIS-K or IS-K, which is an inter-Islamic conflict, because I hate to tell you, not everything is about us, which has been true in every case. So far, the Brotherhood had its issues when its own IS. No one is going to save you but you and the community you built. You're in a weird situation. We can't prefigure socialism. We don't know what that means. I'm not even asking people to do that anymore. I'm not sure actually what they entirely want. The pivot to Asia has never made total sense to me. It's also never been totally viable. There have been aircraft carriers built and moved out a couple of times, and the pivot to Asia is longstanding, even with Obama. But no one's figured out how to utilize it. Biden seems to want to utilize it to do a domestic agenda, but that's not happening. The one thing I will say about Afghanistan is it showed that many of our military elites are dumb in ways that are even hard to comprehend. I like to compare the learning of Asian languages, even Vietnamese, Chinese, Japanese, to the learning of Pashto, etc. in Afghanistan. We never even bothered to learn the language. The military is not going away anytime soon. And it's the most trusted institution in U.S. life. And it's trusted because it's seen as depoliticized. That shows up time and time again. Even though people hate the war machine, the wars are not popular and have not been for a long time. They're only popular after moments of trauma where violent idiocy should be expected psychologically. But as I said there are no adults in the room. There really are no adults in the room. People aren't learning languages that are easy to learn. You live in a country with there are thousands of Mandarin speakers here, and yet they probably don't have anybody in the right places, to understand proper intelligence with China. And we've made that mistake since the 90s when we accidentally, but I think actually probably was an accident, blew up an embassy in Kosovo. This is what I was referring to. Thank you, Sir Balkan. In the U.S. Army, bright non-officers learn Korean and use it, but it's different. But that's from a different age. Everything is farmed out by the Pentagon these days, and no one learns to speak Arabic or Pashto in 20 years. That's the thing. Military Keynesianism and the unitary military state's even ending. We ended that too. I mean, let's talk about drinking our own Kool-Aid, right? There's debates about movements and parties. Both those are signifiers without signifieds. What I mean is a party or a movement have both changed the meaning, like the revolution actually, so much in the 20th century, that I don't necessarily know what someone's saying when they throw those words around. Read this. That's right. The military is trusted because it's seen as depoliticized. If radicals want to be trusted, they should learn a lesson from this. They need to reject sectarianism, stop stealing from the Dems. Sectarianism of the individual, but never of the party. What I mean by that is have your principles and beliefs and fight for them internally, but you know the limit, you know the line. All right? You know this with communities too. You know this with when you really care about it. I know people are so deracinated, maybe this is becoming hard for them to still understand because they don't shut the hell up on social media. But there is a line that you draw where you just don't do certain things, even when you believe it. Not because you don't believe it, not because you aren't going to fight for it, but because you know you need the other person who disagrees with you more than you need to be right. At jobs, those of you who have the luxury of getting them, or at least ones that are worth keeping, this is something that you learn. Yeah, spiritual manlet's completely correct. There are many languages that there are so many languages with millions of speakers, even middle-income countries that barely have any internet presence as for learning programs or technologies. This is true because I hit it as a teacher all the time. Every now and then I'll hit someone who speaks an African dialect that has a pretty big sub-community here, even in Salt Lake, that we can't find translators for. We definitely can't find electronic translation for. It's hard for me to know how effective military propaganda is because military propaganda, like a lot of propaganda, mirrors the culture. You can tell the difference between China's establishment of its military culture outside of its initial revolutionary phase, i.e., today, versus us. This was ironically pointed out to me by Carl Jha, who was actually making a different point than what I drew from it. He talked about how China as a collectivist society, it still believes in its community, but the U.S. is not. And he's right about the U.S., and he's right about China's ability to appeal to collectivism. But what he failed to mention is the U.S. in the 1940s used the exact same kind of propaganda with less technology that the Chinese do now. It's a different stage in empire. Once your imperial elites have been shown to be imperial elites for 2 generations, no one believes that the sacrifice is worth anything. That's the difference. It's not like that there aren't elements of the Chinese army that are shilling for parts of Chinese capital, or the Chinese, even if it's not Chinese capital, the worst parts of the Chinese bureaucratic state. It's just that it's new, and that the history of it doing so is relatively new, and that the revolutionary fervor was real. Our revolutionary fervor is corrupt as parts of it were, but it was real 200 years ago. And it was real in the Civil War, even though that was also corrupt and venial and only partially fought about slavery. The South wanted slaves. The North wanted to stop the expansion of slaves for economic reasons and to appease a few abolitionists. The abolitionists were able to use that to their advantage, and the ultimate chaos, and thus a victory of history, was won. But don't lie to yourself about what the battle started as. Lincoln was honest about it. It is us who projects our fantasies onto the past. I'm going to go have a nice day, but think about the quotes I told you today. All right? What are these gusts of popular sentiment for? Are they to make you feel good and right as an extension of yourself, or are they to actually build a community and create social change? Why do we do what we do? If we don't have the discipline not to do it, what are we doing? Why is there a left celebrity culture? We should ask ourselves these questions. They're not good. They're not going to make us feel good about ourselves. I'm going to enjoy my Labor Day. I'm going to watch Sheepdogs tomorrow and get bekilted because I'm an obnoxious white nerd like that, and more power to me. You guys take care. Learn the best as you can. That, if anything, your responsibility is to learn and to teach and to build. You do not have to complete the work, but you are not free to give it up.